We hebben de kinderrechtencommissaris aan het woord laten. Ik wil eigenlijk net zeggen wat daar allemaal staat, dus leest u samen met mij. We gaan luisteren naar de keynote van Ursula Kilkelly van de University College of Business and Law over het belang van nationale onafhankelijke kinderrechtencommissariaten om het kinderrechten te beschermen. Ursula Kilkelly, the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here on this really important day, on this important event for you all. And what I have to do in the next 25 minutes or so is to give you something of an international perspective on the issues that you've been discussing already in the panel this morning, and will also consider from a further international perspective later on. First, though, most importantly, happy birthday to the Children's Rights Commissioner Office. This is a birthday that I share with you. 25 years ago, I began my own academic career, having just completed my PhD on children's rights and the European Convention on Human Rights. And I started off at a time when I think children's rights were certainly under the Convention in their infancy, relatively speaking. We've seen huge development and growth in the awareness and understanding of the complexity of children's rights issues and the importance of those issues at a national level here and at an international level. And really, the landscape is unrecognisable, I think, from 1997 in that respect. This also feels to me a bit more like a family gathering. We have the founding mothers here, we have former and current commissioner office holders. I know children and young people who've been represented in the great demonstrations on the videos and will be with us later, and for whom this office has, of course, very significant role to play. It has always, for them, been there in their lives over the last 25 years. That's a huge, I think, statement of intergenerational impact, both with regard to who's here in the room today, and if you think about it, the number of children who have grown up in their lives with the office, making that impact, making children's rights present in their lives. This is a significant milestone then by any analysis, and I know from what we've heard already the significant impact that the office has had on law and policy, on how children are treated, especially the vulnerable groups that we heard about earlier, and how children experience their rights. I know firsthand from work that I've done myself here in Belgium that really the office has become part of a very vibrant and dynamic children's rights community. For me, the office and today's celebration is a symbol of that vibrant and I would say demanding children's rights community, demanding of government and demanding of the duty bearers who hold the responsibility ultimately for both the office, its creation, but also, of course, its sustainability. I would also pay tribute to the office's international leadership, which over many years, and we heard about that earlier too, has played a really important leading role. For me, and in the research that I'm going to talk about, the office has really led the way in the development of how a children's rights institution should work, really both in terms of the monitoring function, the complaints and investigations, and the awareness raising, becoming the conscience on behalf of children, becoming the defender of the rights of children through the community, politically, socially, and economically. So as a powerful advocate for children's rights, I congratulate all of you who've been involved in both the establishment and the development and growth of the office over the 25 years that we're celebrating today. If we step back a little bit and look at the international standards that underpin an office of children's rights at a national level, clearly we start with the Paris Principles, the global standards that are really the establishment of the National Human Rights Institution framework. Rooted in the human rights architecture, 1993, when they were adopted, saw a really clear statement of the international community that national human rights institutions were a fundamental part of the architecture of human rights protection. A set of minimum international standards with particular emphasis on independence, on standing, on resourcing and on mandate for all national human rights institutions. They apply equally to all, but I think it's important to reflect both on the time and the context in which the standards were adopted. 1993, not long after the Convention on the Rights of the Child was itself adopted, I think we can acknowledge the generality of the principles while also recognising their importance. And as we've seen, and Lansdowne makes this point very, very clearly, when we view independent children's rights institutions through this lens, we have to recognise very clearly the different legal status that children have, the requirement additionally that we have to take account of their best interests, their evolving capacities, and particularly their right to express their views. That this all requires an adaptation in design and orientation, and I'll come back to that in a second. What's clear is that the Paris Principles, notwithstanding their importance, don't address the specific circumstances, the vulnerabilities, the needs and the legal rights of children for whom the Convention itself stands as a real marker. So actually, when we talk about children's rights institutions, we have to begin, in my view, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. This is obviously the treaty dedicated to children, recognising their vulnerability and particular status, and it builds on human rights laws as a framework for the human rights of children. What's really key is that we have in Article 4 of the Convention a duty to take all measures to implement the Convention, and there is a clear recognition that independent children's rights institutions are key to that process. I describe these institutions as a bridge between the international legal obligations under the Convention and the experience that children enjoy at a national level. The Convention sits at the international level. Children experience their rights here locally, and the independent children's rights institutions are absolutely critical to ensuring that that happens. The Committee on the Rights of the Child, and I know you have your own Belgian member of the committee here with us this morning. The committee very early on recognised the importance of these institutions, adopting only its second general comment on the matter and reinforcing that throughout the general comments, particularly general comment number 5, which concerns implementation. So you see the independent children's rights institution as this really critical component of the duty to implement the Convention. And we've seen through international reporting, the committee consistently raises concerns and issues about the standing of the institutions, their resourcing during state-party dialogue. And I think we all need to remember at all times that sense of international accountability that comes with the committee's reporting process. Just very briefly, the general comment number 2, which concerns the institutions and the standards under the Convention. The committee says that every state needs an independent human rights institution with responsibility for promoting and protecting children's rights. Yes, it says whatever its form, it must be able to independently and effectively monitor, promote and protect children's rights with a constitutional mandate, ideally, or at least one in legislation, a broad mandate very specifically dealing with the Convention and its protocols. And this is, I think, really key, that accessibility to children, the extent to which children engage with the institution, and from whom the institutions draw their authority, I think, means that they must have direct contact with children and an engagement that is at the heart, at the foundation of such an office. And obviously the committee then identifies separately that notion of independence and resourcing as really fundamental. Going on to address the powers that any such office should have, really interestingly, and I think separate, and this is important, distinct from the Paris Principles, the office, the committee says, must have the power to consider complaints from children, to carry out investigations, and to litigate and make third-party interventions on children's behalf. And that's a difference in emphasis, and that, in my view, goes back to the authority where the institutions draw their authority from to advocate, represent, and promote and protect the rights of children. It also talks, of course, about these other activities that are really important: undertaking investigations, preparing recommendations, keeping law and policy under review, promoting harmonisation, and with a broad scope to do that both with regard to public and private entities. And I believe very clearly that the Commissioner's Office here does all of, has a significant mandate in those areas and has very clear priorities that align with General Comment number 2. If we look then at the international level, and I mentioned the really important role that the Office has played internationally over many years, what we see in the global trend is a real incremental establishment of the institution of children's rights at a national level, building on the national human rights institution movement, but also very much aligned with the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So we can see, since in particular the Convention was adopted, real consistent gradual growth in the establishment of these offices around the world, and the extent to which they align with General Comment number 2, the committees and the Convention's standards. We see the number of offices increase. Yes, the variety is very rich, but we also see offices with real impact, with creativity, with innovation, and in particularly involving children and young people in their work in really fundamental ways. From the first office then in Norway in 1981, we've now, we think, around about 200 offices worldwide, increase in the number of national human rights institutions. They are, in fact, a unique, and this is, I think, a unique movement around children's rights, separate to the movement around national human rights institutions more generally. ENOC was mentioned, the European Network, and I think the European, that has had a very significant influence on the European existence of these institutions, but has allowed Europe also to play a role of leadership more globally, and I think that's something that's been really important to observe and watch in my work. Research has indicated the significant strength and impact of these offices in the implementation of children's rights, and I've just listed some of the people who've been involved in leading our understanding globally of the work. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the continued effectiveness and in fact the continued standing and existence of these offices cannot be taken for granted. In the same way that I think our vigilance around the protection and promotion of children's rights is an ongoing, continuous process, I think we also need to remain vigilant about the extent to which the offices themselves are under threat. And I say that with a global view. In particular, I looked just at the very most recent concluding observations of the committee. And in no less than 5 instances in 2022, the committee raised concerns about the diminution in offices that already exist and the need to, in its recommendations, really draw out a greater resourcing, independence and mandate improvements for these offices. Canada is an interesting case in point. Here, the committee in this year alone just expressed serious concern at the lack of an independent children's rights commissioner at federal level and regretted, very diplomatic speak, for clearly a very serious concern, the closing of the Ontario Child Advocate Office. Canada was urged to expeditiously establish an independent mechanism at the federal level and restore the office of the Ontario Child Advocate and its entire previous mandate. So that's a really worrying indication of both the reality on the ground for these offices and for children's rights more generally, and also, I think importantly, the robust manner in which the committee is ensuring and accountability on the part of the state party, and a driving of that expectation around the existence and the resourcing and so on of the office. New Zealand, interestingly, is undergoing a similar dialogue, and again, I think it is part of a concerning development. On the more positive front, and I think to reflect again the committee's role in relation to Cyprus, the committee in 2022 welcomed the appointment of a commissioner and made recommendations about its independence and mandate and resourcing. So really looking all the time to monitor what states are doing in this space and ensuring that pressure is maintained. In relation to these three examples, Croatia, Greece and Iceland, the committee again this year alone called for the strengthening of legislative mandates, called for increased resourcing around sustainability of the office in Greece, for instance, and repeated recommendations made previously in relation to the need for an independent, effective and accessible complaints mechanism with regard to the Office of Ombudsman. That's in relation to Iceland. So you can see the level of engagement that the committee has undertaken in relation to independent children's rights institutions, and how that vigilance plays out in the monitoring process when state parties must hold themselves to account before the formal processes of the United Nations treaty monitoring bodies. The value on a more positive level of independent children's rights institutions, though, should not be understated. Not just a vigilance for what we might lose, but actually the real positive added value that the institutions bring to the whole endeavour of children's rights protection and promotion. Certainly where we have functions and powers that are specific to children's unique status and vulnerability and tailored to their needs and circumstances, we see a really extensive and effective mandate, being able to contribute to the extent to which children enjoy their rights on a day-by-day basis. The really progressive examples of these offices have Article 3, the best interest principle, Article 5, the principle of evolving capacity in the exercise of children's rights, and Article 12, of course, the right to say in decision making, as key to their authority. And we've heard already examples of how these issues are all intertwined in the office here, really adding value to the integrity and the authority of the work that the office does. And we see that equally in those offices around the world that are most consistently aligned with the children's rights standards that I've mentioned. The three areas that our research has analysed have been around advocacy, awareness raising and complaints. Advocacy, sort of a soft word for actually what is a really critical power and authority for an independent children's rights institution. This is fundamentally about addressing children's inherent lack of power in a whole range of spheres, especially the legal and political sphere, and we had a great example of that from the work that the office did here around the coronavirus. Even with an independent children's rights institution, in many countries it was extraordinarily difficult to ensure that children were front and centre, taken into account as part of the measures against the global pandemic. What is crucial is to have an independent voice as an advocate and an authority on children's rights in these debates, inserting all the time the perspective, the experience, the rights of children. In terms of the other work, I think that's really critical around this in terms of advocacy is that legal political sphere also in terms of lawmaking, remaining vigilant, monitoring and making recommendations to enhance law and policy at a national level. Awareness raising, of course, is critically important, and the Convention is unique in having an international legal duty upon states parties to ensure children are aware and informed of their rights, and adults also. Crucial, again, to children's rights implementation. And then finally, a whole area of complaints, where really with an accessible, adapted and child-specific mechanism, you have a level of accountability on behalf of children for how they are treated for the extent to which they enjoy their rights. There was a whole movement around child-friendly justice which relates to this point, and I think the role of a commissioner with a complaints function really does enable a level of accountability on behalf of children that goes way beyond offices that don't have that very specific targeted power. So to conclude, I think it's really important to reflect the context in which any independent children's rights institution is evaluated. The unique status both of children and of children's rights, I think, demands dedicated structures that oversee implementation and accountability with and for children. We know that the reputation of the office is known to you all here in Flanders, but also at a national level, and I would say also from my research at an international level, and it is to be commended for its leadership over many, many years in this area. Of course, evaluation, analysis, research is really critical. We have to continue to push forward for continuous improvement. That's both necessary with regard to not standing still. When I did some work with Unicef UK here nearly 10 years ago now, I was really struck by the extent to which the community was determined not to allow the gains that had been made over many years to fall back. And I think we need to always remain vigilant, both with regard to the challenges for children's rights. I heard about climate, coronavirus, poverty, huge fundamental issues for children, but equally for the institutions that defend and advocate on behalf of children and children's rights. So in that context, really important to look at ways in which we can strengthen and enhance these offices around the world, both on an intergenerational basis and in terms of the children who we all serve today. So I'm really delighted to be part of your event today, and I look forward to hearing further perspectives from other guests as we go through this morning. But congratulations to everyone who's been involved in the work of the Commissioner, and best of luck for the next 25 years.
Thank you, Ursula Kilkelly, for your thoughts on the importance of the international network of kinderrechtencommissariaten. We gaan er internationale sprekers bij halen, maar daar moet ik meteen bij zeggen dat het C-woord dat we niet graag gebruiken 2 van onze sprekers thuishoudt. Dat zijn Marie Andersson de Frutos van de, en dan probeer ik het goed uit te spreken, de Barnombudsmannen van Zweden, het kinderrechtencommissariaat van Zweden. Die is er niet. En ook Gisela Gori van de Council of Europe zal jammer genoeg niet deel kunnen nemen aan het internationaal gesprek. Maar ik heb wel een tekst gekregen van Regina Jensdottir. Zij is van de Council of Europe Coordinator for the Rights of the Child. En ze heeft gevraagd om die tekst, voor we aan het internationaal debat beginnen, voor te lezen. Dus van de Council of Europe. The Council of Europe Strategy for the Rights of the Child was adopted by the Committee of Ministers on the 23rd of February this year, and will pave the way for the work of our organization and our member states for the next 6 years. Our mission, together with all of our 46 member states, including, of course, Belgium, is to strengthen the human rights of children across the board and in all settings, including at local and regional level, at state level and in Europe. The new strategy is a natural continuation of our work and has 6 strategic objectives: protecting children from violence, strengthening child-friendly justice, child participation, ensuring equality and fighting discrimination, and ensuring that the rights of the child are respectively upheld in technological developments and in emergency situations. This can obviously not be achieved in isolation, but requires the commitment and the collaboration of all relevant players: our international and European partners, national governments, civil society, and of course, children themselves. Amongst the key institutions that children count on, together with the Council of Europe, are ombudspersons or commissioners for the rights of the child, which thankfully are in place in most of the member states of the Council of Europe. Today, more than ever, is there a need for independent review and monitoring of legislation, policies, and practices. Today, more than ever, we need strong states that hold up the values of the Council of Europe, that protect the human rights of children, that ensure that national and regional legislation is human rights compliant, and that all can participate in decision-making processes, including children. While state institutions regularly change, undergo reforms, or change orientation with political colors of government, it is crucial that the people living in our societies can continue to depend on independent and impartial institutions that uphold human rights, including the rights of the child. We are looking forward to supporting the implementation of the new Council of Europe strategy for the rights of the child through European activities and in partnership with our national and regional partners, such as the Flemish Children's Rights Commissioner. We depend on your experience and knowledge of children's situations and challenges on the ground in order to provide the right responses, both in the long term and to create sustainable well-being for children, and in the short term to jointly respond to emerging and topical challenges. All the best for the next 25 years of this important institution and for the next cooperation opportunities that are coming to all of us. Was signed by Regina Jensdottir, Council of Europe Coordinator for the Rights of the Child. Dat was de tekst die ze ons zeker wilde bezorgen. En dan gaan we nu praten. En dat gaan we doen met Natalia Alonso van Unicef, met Karl Hansson Center for Children's Rights Studies en Benoît van Kersbulk, Defense for Children International Belgium, member of the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. Can I ask you all to join me here, please? Aangenaam. I'll be sitting here. You can take whatever seat you want. And welcome. We discussed and we heard in the keynote before the coffee break the importance of an independent kinderrechtencommissariat, not only in Flanders, Belgium, but in the rest of Europe. We heard the Council of Europe. The text we just heard was also to emphasize the importance. What are you taking away from the keynote, if I may start with you?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Natalia Alonso from Unicef, and I would like firstly to apologize on behalf of Gert Capellare, who is the director of the office here and who couldn't be with you today. But just to reconfirm that for Unicef, this is really an important moment. You are family. We share the same mandate. We have the same, let's say, commitment and obligations to make the CRC a reality, because it's a very important framework, but we have to see that in the lives of every child. So, just to say, answering to your question about what was important, I will make just 3 points here. I think it's really important to think through that no matter what, we need check and balances. Check and balances in a structure, in a society that makes sure that the rights of children are respected, are promoted. And even if we think that we have all the mechanisms in place, we need independent structures, independent compliance mechanism to look at what's happening. We cannot be complacent. We have progressed a lot since 1989. We agree with that. But we cannot be complacent because situations change. There are new challenges, and I think we're going to be talking about that afterwards. There are new challenges coming up, And children need a space to be able to share the concerns. So the first thing is we need check and balances. Second thing is the voices of children. And that leads me to the second point. How much, and I think we have seen in other experiences like in climate change we were talking about, and how children's voices have been able to be shared, have been able to take the floor. That was kind of news, maybe not for this community, but for a lot of people out there. The issue that children were out claiming the space was really important. But we have to make sure that the most vulnerable are also heard. And the third point is about having a channel to have a complaints mechanism in place, where investigation is taking place, where research is taking place on what are the complaints. So those are the three main things I'm taking from that. Thank you.
Okay. For the Center for Children's Rights Studies, Mr. Hansson, what is your takeaway from what we heard?
First, I thank you so much en bedankt dat ik het in het Engels mag doen. Ik vind het een hele eer om op een internationaal panel te zitten in Vlaanderen, waar ik opgegroeid ben en ook gedoctoreerd heb. So I'll continue in English. I'm sorry for my Flemish in between. Just to say that I think it's and I have this. Well, you spoke about the family. I don't think in my professional life, speaking of family, but there is such a thing. Like there's a group of people, and I was suffering from FOMO before coming here. You know, the fear of missing out. Mm-hmm. And I did not want to miss this party, so I took a train this night instead of the plane because there was no plane anymore. I wanted to be here, then I was late, but I'm still here. And I'm very, very happy and excited to be here. Now, so this question on what struck me most was on the last slide, was about Ursula saying that Flanders has a standing, has something to say, or has an impact in the field. And that brought me back to the beginnings of this. So we will later on listen to people who were here in 1997 when the decree
when the basis was laid out
was
for what
discussed.
we see now, yes.
But I think we have to go back earlier than 1997. And I brought with me some quotes, and one is a preface from Malfeit Flecker's doctoral thesis. So, as was said, Malfeit Flecker was between 1981 and 1989 the first ombudsperson for children in the world. She was in Norway and did her PhD in 1991 at Ghent University with Eugene Verhellen. So Eugene writes in his preface of her book, of her thesis in 1993, and he wrote, "The importance of fundamental research on children's rights, which takes shape here, cannot be sufficiently stressed. The subject deserves, especially because of its social importance, a prominent structural presence in an academic forum." Now, I'm pleased to say that because I continued also myself working in academia. So that the point I'd like to make is that when you have a strong and vibrant and a very strong institution like in Flanders today, that is also because before that there was a strong community, also a research community, people who were working on that. And even 93 or 91 I think we still need to go back further. It was December 1987, and I don't know if many people of you were there, but in December 1987 there was a conference called Ombudswerk for Children. I didn't brought the book, it was too heavy, but so it was Ombudswerk for Children 1987, and there came a book out of it with also Eugene prefaces the book, and to give you a few of the quotes of that time. So we're back in 1987, so that's before things started here, where he wrote about the idea of the importance of looking at children's rights, and ombudswerk for children was being theorized. There was not so much at that time. Malfeit Flecker was one of the presenters, so I guess I wasn't there. Anke, you were there, but between 87 and 91, that was the time when they've met, and that made then also possible that she did a PhD with Eugene. But he said, well, attention should not only be paid to the position of children as children, but simultaneously, and in a more substantial way, to the position of children as human beings. It was this idea that children are above all human beings, and not just human beings to be, which constituted the main subjects of the Congress Week. So that Congress in 1987, leading to a lot of work that was been done later on. I just give you a last quote from this preface that was published in '89 around the backgrounds and why are we busy, or why do we think this is important. So Eugene writes about this collected volume. "We hope that this rich collection of texts will reach those people all over the world who want to get information on basic practice, policy and research, and want to go into the development of a more just and democratic society. Because that is where the attention for children's rights derives its importance from in the first place. Now, I think, well, the world over, it has reached some of its potential. So sometimes people think of work in academia that it's just in an ivory tower. I do think we have a proof, like an empirical proof, when people ask, does your work have any impact? Not my work, but work of my predecessors. At least it have an impact. And if I may, just to move on that, because what happened in '97, when we then had in Flanders a very, I must say, progressive parliamentary ombudsperson, or children's commissioner, it influenced also abroad. So other countries were influenced and inspired by what happened. And Benoit, you will take that from me, but even this country just next door in the French community, they were before us. They had in '92 already legislation installing le Délégué Général aux Droits de l'Enfant, but that was a government. It was not independent. It was not by parliament. And it was only after the '97 Flemish, having seen the Flemish decree, with the independence and attaching the institute to the parliament, that also in the French community, they changed and it became also a parliamentary Délégué Général aux Droits de l'Enfant. So that's, well, I mean, it's a bit of a joke in this sense that it is still in Belgium, but it of course went beyond. And I had the chance then in my own academic life of working with other people. I had a PhD student, Roberta Ruggiero, who did her PhD on the ombudspersons. And just to end, that's part of the story. Where I'm now, I work in Switzerland. So Roberta just recently got a mandate from the Swiss federal government to look into how should we maybe in Switzerland at the federal level create a commissioner for children with a complaints mechanism. And so it's not stopping here. I mean, it's still going on, and there's a lot of interest that continues to be. But I'll come back on some of these questions later on.
Yes, let's switch to Benoit. Because Karl Hansson already referred to you, do you want to talk about what he referred to as how maybe Flanders or Belgium has had a lead role in the world?
I can certainly elaborate on that, but first of all, let me say that I'm so happy to be here and to be. I'm sitting in a panel which is so-called international, but coming from Belgium and being with a Belgian colleague, and Unicef is represented, but your colleague Geert is also from Belgium, and all those people are members of a very big family. And when I come here, I see so many people that I know for so long. People with whom I have been setting up the DCI in Belgium, National Coalition in Belgium. So I feel that I'm here in a family with different members, and of course, you know, celebrating with the family is always important. I could talk from the national point of view, but also from the international point of view, because now I have the honor and privilege to be member of this UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which was mentioned by Ursula, explained at large, and she said it all. And I think that maybe, yeah, from what Karl just said, we can see that this is a construction, and that is a construction that takes time. You know, you don't build a house from one day to another. You need to put bricks on bricks, and but you have to ensure that the basement is solid enough to have this building. And in my view, we have a lot of cornerstones, the stones that are so important that if you don't have them, your building will never keep up.
And what are these cornerstones you're referring to?
And one of those cornerstones for me is certainly the ombudsperson for children that should exist in all countries. But you know, being in the Committee on the Rights of the Child, sometimes I wonder when I receive delegations from states who do not have children's ombudsman yet, should we recommend to Somalia, to South Sudan, to Yemen today to have an ombudsman for children? Could an ombudsman for children in those kind of context deliver anything? I think it's absolutely needed, but it would be absolutely a challenge that is so huge for one person to try to solve all the other problems. So you need also...
You're referring to countries that are at war and where it's really difficult to maybe make something that can be independent and fight for the children's rights, because that's not their biggest problem.
No, it is their biggest problem. Children's rights, it's at the beginning of just about everything in my view. But, you know, if you are, and there are many people here who could talk about it much better than I could, but if you are in Yemen today and you have a complaint from a child whose rights are not respected because he or she receives bombs on a daily basis, I don't think that the ombudsman alone can do much. So what I want to say is that this is a piece of a bigger picture. It's an essential piece, but it is one of the pieces. And without all other actors at national level, but also the civil society and other actors, and with the involvement of children, it's difficult to build this house with all these cornerstones. And this is, I think, the main message. And when I listened to Ursula's presentation, we can see that it has been built little by little with a contribution and with a context in each country which is different.
You referred to Norway previously. We had invited the Barnombudsmannen from Sweden, but due to something called Corona, she's not able to be here. But Elisabeth Dalin made a little movie, 2-minute message, that she wants us to have a look at.
Thank you so much for the invitation to attend this important academic seminar. First of all, I'd like to congratulate our colleagues in Flanders in the Ombudsman's office on the 25th anniversary. We are 3 years older, so we are feeling like the big sister with an extremely good relation with our colleagues in Flanders. I am Elisabeth Dalin. I'm the Ombudsman for Children in Sweden. We have an office of around 38 persons. And basically we have 5 things that we're supposed to do. And that is to follow up how the Convention on the Right of the Child is adhered to represent the rights of children and young people in Sweden. If we see that the Convention is not followed, to propose legal changes or procedural changes. We are also following the international child rights development, and we have a clear mandate by law to participate in the public debate and to advocate for children's rights. I am actually the only Director General in the government that has to do that by law, which I'm very happy for. The Convention on the Right of the Child became Swedish law effective of January 1st, 2020. This was after a long discussion in Parliament, which ended with a vote to make it international law. It is a big step forward for the rights of children in Sweden, but we still see that there's a lot of work to do, particularly when it comes to the best interest of the child. How is that done on different governmental levels, be it national, be it regional, be it on the municipality level? The other one is child participation. How do we make sure that children are actually actively taking part in decisions concerning themselves? And thirdly, the need for child rights impact analysis in all decisions involving children. So we still have a lot to do, but we are very happy that the Convention became national law, because it means that we can push child rights much harder and on all levels. Hope you will have a fantastic discussion today. I really wished I could have been present. And again, congratulations on the 25th anniversary.
Misschien applaus, ze zal het niet horen, maar... what strikes me the most is that you're all on the same page about how we need to get things done when it comes down to children's rights. We refer to Norway, now this is Sweden. We usually in Europe look to Northern Europe as a sort of guiding countries for what we want to do, especially when it comes down to things like children's rights. Is there something to learn from Sweden?
Well, definitely, and what I wanted to make, and I think she was very clear about the struggle, in fact, even in Northern Europe, of how much effort and discussions took to actually kind of transform that into law and make it a reality, and she's very clear what is missing. So there's a pathway to implement. What I wanted to mention here is how important it is also to think through not only looking at the progress ahead and the challenges ahead that sometimes look a bit daunting, like in the case of Yemen and Somalia's children's rights situations, but also what happens when we don't have these structures with those blocks on which to build, when we take for granted certain things. And I wanted to bring an example, for example, that we're working on the European Union and the European Parliament, how, after years, has been possible to create the position of a coordinator on the rights of the child. And in fact, in the last elections, the Community on Child Rights were really pushing to have a commissioner in the European Commission structure to be in charge of child rights exclusively. Hasn't happened yet. We're still very much kind of pushing for that. We have the Vice President.
Why is it so important to have a European Commissioner
precisely of what she was saying from Sweden is like all the legislations, environmental legislation of the EU is about 70% of what is implemented at national level. How this is being assessed vis-a-vis children's rights, how the voice of children are listened in this reality that is them. But it's also, that's environment, but it's also access to justice, etc. Is that we need to ensure that policies and legislation at the European level are really child-sensitive, that they are child-proofed, as we call them.
Like do a children check when you put in place new legislation?
Exactly.
Like you do with poverty, or also do a child check?
Exactly. That they should be checking out what is the impact, to listen what are their priorities, and somehow take that into account.
What would be, well, of course the benefit would be that we talk about it, but why hasn't it happened yet? Why are legislation makers not top of mind when it comes down to children's rights? Why do we need a commissioner to convince them?
It's sad that we need one, you could say, because they're, as the idea, they're human beings like everybody, but the classic, that was a question asked, I go back to the ancient, to Malfeit Flecker. She said, why do we need, when she was presenting her things and she was in Ghent in conferences and so on, and people asked, why do you need one? Because tomorrow we will need a commissioner for the elder, and then one for the dogs, and one for the cats, and whatever. And her answer was quite...
Maybe we do need
her answer was rather simple. She said, well, children don't vote. That was something, I think still it's a very strong question. So if you have a parliamentary democracy and people vote, and then there is a category that doesn't vote. Now I think it's you could elaborate much more on it, or you could, why would you need it much further than just this thing, the right to vote. But I must comment also a bit on what was said before me. I do think that these structures, they do need to be embedded into a system. You can't just take, in Somalia, I always like to think of North Korea as, put an ombudsperson, you're going to be an ombudsperson in North Korea. Doesn't make any sense. You need to have at least some basic ideas about democracy, because this is a watchdog function of democracy. So it fits into that, and you can't just export it.
You need the one to enhance the other.
Yeah, it fits into, now, on these Swedish, well, I have a Swedish name. I'm not Swedish at all, but I can allow to say that when kids come at my place in the evening and we are going to eat, they can eat also at my place. I don't know if you follow this Swedish gate. not everything that comes from Sweden is just to be copied. And there is something, we have, of course, this like Scandinavian idyllic world, but sometimes I also think it is a bit exaggerated, and we have to be careful with this ombuds, and we export it and everybody needs one. I don't think it's just a system that you export. So you need to look into this type of countries.
Well, you have international references, of course, Benoit van Kersbilk, because being part of the UN committee. Why is it, well, it's not possible to implement a child rights commissioner just from the get-go and like copy the Swedish model or the Norwegian model or the Belgian model in every other country, because it's culturally embedded as well?
Yes, probably. But still, I think that there are many features that are at the basis of which model you will have. It has to be there. And I think that Ursula this morning recalled it very clearly. It has to be independent. It has to carry the voice of the children. And this is also something very important to make a link to what Carl just said. We need someone to take children seriously. And the society doesn't do it per se. We
saw when it came down to environment, children were laughed at when they came onto the streets to make their point. They were set aside by some parts of community as we don't need to listen to them because they don't know what they're talking about.
That's exactly one of the examples I had in mind. When Greta Thunberg went to the UN to speak to the most important people on this planet, or at least they think they are, so many people were laughing at her and saying, go back to school, study, and then you will come back. I think that she and all the youngsters who have been involved in those demonstrations for months and months have done more than the biggest NGOs with huge budget for their communication, advocacy, lobbying, and so on for the climate case. And so I think that if you listen to children, if you take them seriously, if you fight against all the people who will try to silence them, because that's one of the risks. I was talking about the fact that human rights, children's rights, it's a fragile building. We have all the time the risk of going backwards. The human rights defenders, it's not an easy task in many places, but there is also the risk of having the children's rights washing. There is a goodwill, but using children's rights as an excuse to implement measures against children's rights. We had an example we have an example just now in Brussels. The city of Brussels decided to ban the fact that children are begging with their parents and imposing a fine against those parents. They will have to beg even more to pay the fine that they have to pay.
So legislation can also backfire.
Yeah, and this is under the name of children's rights or in pretending to defend children's rights. So there is a risk of using instrumentalization of the rights of the children against them.
Yeah, because that brings me to the question, one of the questions we are here for. What are the threats for for children's rights per se in the near future? That's one of them. Do you see other challenges?
Well, I think we all are aware about, for example, I would say challenges, threats, but also opportunities, the digital world.
We can talk about all.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity, but also a threat if it's not managed properly. So the digital world brings all the opportunities for education, for social contact. We know that that's quite positive, but also how has increased, for example, the violence online for children. And we've seen that during the COVID times, that in fact has been a massive increase of cases that are very worrisome about that. So that's one of the threats. Digitalization, the digital environment per se.
Has the Center done studies on digitalization already and the influence on children's rights or the threats or the opportunities?
Well, I haven't been involved myself but of course it's part of a big discussion and a discourse around. And I think the example that we've looked, well, was an interesting example. The Committee on the Rights of the Child gave a general comment on children's rights in the digital age, and that was a great example of how children were actively involved in the drafting of international lawmaking. So in that sense, but I did not do myself this research on the negative, positive impact. What you do know is that for children and young people, it's an important tool for expressing themselves. And
how can we separate the threats from the opportunities and have as least threats as we possibly can?
I think look at it just, well, as these are things like anything else. It's like a bicycle can be very dangerous. Playing outside can be very dangerous also. We don't put helmets on kids because they go and play outside. When they are also in the digital sphere, they could do good and bad things.
So they need digital helmets.
Well, I don't know if they need digital helmets. I think there's also some good sense into looking into it. Now, for me, one of the threats, I don't know if we very often in children's rights, we think of us versus them. In the sense they are against children's rights, and here we all together in favor of children's rights. I think to a certain extent that is okay. That is correct. I felt the example in Flanders of the questionnaire to kids on the COVID was a great example of how you can raise the voice of children also in the political sphere. I live in Switzerland. I hadn't heard of anything the like, and the impact was very, very different. So children were not at all considered during this pandemic. So I think that's where you could think of us, the children, or those who are arguing in favor of children's rights versus them. Now, but there is also a threat by always thinking in these kind of terms. Also within the field of children's rights, there's this discussion, and you say, yes, children want to go for climate strikes, etc., but not all. I see pictures in the newspaper, children say, great decision of the American court that abortion is now illegal. And that also happens. And when you say we have to listen to children, well, sometimes you have to listen to children and to things you don't like or you dislike, even if we, as children's rights people, think they have a voice, and they use that voice to say things with which I disagree. Now, and I think that's an important, well, I would say the threat, I don't know if it's a threat, but for me the threat is continuing doing as if we are still in some beginning where we have children's rights and they don't have it. I think we are settled as a field of children's rights, but be also clear that sometimes we will not agree. And I think one of the things is we look still into, when I saw the Swedish example, come on, there's a law 30 years old, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and they are very proud that they have now incorporated into their national law. I have a doubt about that. Is that so? Wow, it's 30 years old, so that's a compromise made in 1989. And but we think of it as implementing and up from top to bottom. What really happens is looking also what children can put into the international sphere. And I give a very nice, I would say, warm example of how children can be from the local also influence what internationally happens. And I think the whole thematic of sisterhood and brotherhood, it is not in the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So you can't implement and saying when children are being placed in foster care, in foster families, you need to make sure that brothers and sisters are there together. There's something very vague as the best interest of the child, but there's not such a thing as brothers and sisters. And it were young people who brought it up and who felt once they were adult, they said, look, you had cut me off from my ties. I had horizontally with my sisters or my brothers after having been placed. And especially in France, I think the defense, La Défenseur des Enfants of France, was very instrumental in raising that point. And now in international documents, you would find it being there. So, and it's a point where I think that's interesting because we hadn't thought of it before. Thanks to children's input, you have themes that come up. Now that is something we can still agree upon. In my own field of work, I work on child labor. There you have very contentious discussions where in Bolivia in 2014 had a legislation lowering the minimum age of child labor that was made out of working children's organizations said we want to influence the legislation. The whole ILO, whole of Unicef, the whole of the EU went on top of that country saying, you can't do that. This is against international law. And so where young people might have different opinions, but we then tend to silence them down because we all know what children's rights ought to be. So I think for me the threat, or my invitation is to complexify the debate, to continue this conversation, but also to understand that at some points we might not be in agreement amongst people who are in favor of emancipating or taking children serious, but so be it, and what do we do with our controversies? Okay, good questions. We'll go back to those in a few, but I haven't heard you on digitalization yet, Benoit van Kersbilk. What are the threats and the opportunities, and of course, how do we tackle them? Because it's a digital world our children live in, and it's a world we, as the grown-ups,
don't always know as they do.
Yeah, that's true, and this is why indeed the Committee on the Right of the Child has written a general comment on the topic, and this is a good example, besides the one that was provided by Carl, that many things were not thought of 30 years ago. Of course, at that time, the digital world was not developed as it is now. But still, we have to. We will not change the convention every year or every 5 years, and so we need to interpret and to understand or to think about the content of the convention in this world that is changing all the time and very quickly. And so we cannot imagine and even measure the challenges that are ahead of us, and this is one of them. Challenges, opportunities again, because the use of the technology just to access to information. Access to information is key to implement your right.
But not for every child an opportunity, because some children don't have access.
It can be an opportunity and a threat for most of the children. And so what they also need and what adults have to keep in mind is that a child still needs education, needs support, needs adults that are taking care of them, that are listening to them, that are asking them, okay, what do you do? What are you looking at or watching on your smartphone? Just talk about it and be open. Of course, we know that a child can probably very easily find dangerous information or be at risk on the internet.
Because they are subject, of course, to fake news as well in their digital world.
Yeah, but this is why when education comes in, if a child is able to make a difference or to think, maybe this is not true, maybe I have to look for other sources of information. So that's the role of education. Education is key and crucial and central, but also I would say access to remedies. If your rights are not respected, you need accessible remedies and a way to implement your right or to complain when something is not happening. And the system must be able to listen to the child and to give an answer to the child which fits to his or her needs and to give an answer to the violation of the rights.
But is that always possible? Because the needs can't always be answered, of course.
The needs, no, but the rights should.
Yeah.
Can I? A thought, well, an idea to structure these debates. We had this we learned from Eugene also, the to, in, and through rights. When you could say we have rights to access to these digital media. Also, children do have access to express themselves, but then they also have rights in. So they need to be protected from misuse. And through, I think, the dimension which we sometimes overlook is that when young people use digital media, they also do it in an instrumental function. Why? Just to meet friends, to do other things. And I had students doing work in difficult countries, like in countries where homosexuality is prohibited. They do work with girls, looking at how they use social media as a space to socialize in a country where having homosexual relationships or being known as a lesbian girl is prosecuted by your criminal law. And so you can also see the power that these instruments, or well, we think a bit back 10 years ago at the Arab Spring, that was also said how influential these media have been at that time. So, and I do think that is, so you can't just only say, oh, be careful and this goes too far and young people will have these big thumbs and they will only look at screens. I think you need to look at it in its context, and that simple notion of you have rights to, through, and in could be helpful to look at it holistically or in a comprehensive manner. I think that's some invitation of the children's rights. Because
you brought up the point of digitalization. How can we tackle the threats according to you? What's the best way?
I would say I agree with Benoit in that point, in the sense that no matter what is the issue, we're talking digitalization, but we can be talking about other issues, is the principles of the rights of the child that stay, and is that kind of framework that we need to interpret and apply. And I think that's, in the case of digitalization, hard to manage that well. There are different ways about that, but education and being educated on that, having alternatives, having guidance, being also protected about grooming and all kind of predators that foster. But that happens in the digital world as it happens in the external, in the real world. And we have been able to put certain measures there to protect children. So it's not rocket science, so to say. It's just applying that kind of principle.
It's common sense.
Yeah, it's common sense, and being conscious that the best interest of the child is really the framework that we need to move around, and to see the child as an individual. Because one of the points that was raised before as well, in terms of how children's rights have sometimes been kind of instrumentalized, manipulated against the children per se, and also, and we have this debate within Europe as well in terms of the family, kind of the family concept, the family rights versus the individual of the children, but also by states in a certain way, vis-a-vis, for example, the migration or children on the move, as we call them, right? So what is the best interest versus the migratory, let's say, tagging that you can put. So I think that those are the issues to think through.
And that we need to be prepared, as Karel just said, to listen to an opinion we might not agree with. And that's maybe even harder to turn those into policies, because they may be in the best interest for the child, but as a society, we feel like it doesn't fit us.
Exactly, and I think this is something that we confront every day, in the sense of it's kind of well accepted. For example, talking to children, having an interview, for example, for politicians, for members of the European Parliament is great. But are they ready to listen to questions that they might not be, or answers that they might not be in agreement? So somehow we tend to have this idealistic kind of image that children are going to follow and they're going to be all kind of nice and sweet with us. And it's not the case, and we should be grown-ups in that sense as well.
Yeah. Now, moving forward, how do we, as a Human Rights Commissioner, or maybe as a world, how do we maximize the potential we have in protecting children's rights? Where do we go from here? Because we are not all at the same pace, as we heard from Benoit. There are countries where children's rights are nowhere. We have countries who are leading countries in the world. How can we maximize the potential that's already there? Who wants to? Do you want to begin, Benoit?
Yeah, I think that if we look behind, 30 years is very short in the history of humanity, of course. And though I think that we can identify a lot of progress, children's rights are a bit more mainstreamed in the society in general. I would say that here in Belgium, very few people could say, no, children's rights are not important. I mean, openly, they will try to shape it in another way. So I think that things are moving forward. We have to ensure that the mechanisms are in place and strong enough. And one of those mechanisms could also be to push states to go further. It's the third protocol of the convention. We haven't mentioned it yet, but it's one of my favorites. This protocol allows a child to bring a case to the Committee on the Rights of the Child at the international level when he or she didn't receive a reply or didn't see his or her rights respected at national level. And the committee, through this protocol, can take a decision and oblige a state to do something that they didn't want to do. One of the last examples is the situation of children from France that are living in the camps in Syria, and that are living in such bad condition that their life is threatened on a daily basis. And the questions that were raised to the committee are really new questions. does France have an obligation to protect children who are probably French citizens, but it's not proven because they were born outside of the country?
And because of the paternity and security,
and they
you don't
live,
know.
they don't have a birth certificate, they live outside of the country. So has France a responsibility to protect those children there? And the committee said, yes, you have to do that. And if you are not responsible of the ill treatment, you are responsible of the fact that the ill treatment continues because you have the power to stop it. And so this brings
It's also a discussion we saw in Belgium.
And it's
with bringing
of course,
those children back, and can mothers join or not?
Exactly. That's it was the case against France, but the decision that was taken is applicable to all countries. So this is the way to continue moving forward and trying to make the best use of this instrument. Also in the fight for the climate change, we have issued some decisions that are, I hope so, groundbreaking and bring us a bit further and give children new tools to protect their own rights.
Karel, how do we move forward from this?
I think, I'll sit on my academic desk or behind my academic desk. The question brought me to, I've recently published an editorial, and I very irrespectfully called it Reinventing Children's Rights. So saying to reinvent the whole thing. And well, to go on that, I do think we need to continuously discuss, conceptualize, reflect on it in a very deep manner. In a way, when you overlook at the field, I make this distinction between you have aristocratic and grassroots perspectives. It's a bit like you have people who would emphasize children's rights to autonomy, and others who would say no, children need to be protected. So you have this tension between these two kind of strong opposing forces within the field of children's rights. But if you look at them very carefully, all agree that in fact what we want is to have a better world in the future, that the whole children's rights project rests on this premise that tomorrow can be better than today, that we will make altogether a better society tomorrow, even if some of these perspectives are opposing against, I would say, autonomy protection. But the whole thing, or the whole project of making tomorrow better than today sits very difficult with the notion of considering children as actual human beings in the here and now. And that's a tension, but I'm sorry I bring you to these conceptual questions I'm fond of, and I like to understand how to get out of it. But it's about, we want as a society, well, children are the future, and we don't want to give it up, because it's, of course, what modernity gave us as a hope that we can strive for a future that is better than today. But at the same time, we do want children to give them a place in the here and now. And how can you reconcile these two? I think that's a very challenging point. I could be busy for the next 25 years.
Yeah, I can see by your smile you're up for it. So,
yes, totally, yes.
We'll talk in 20 years.
All right, I'm going to be much more down to earth to that kind of landing in. How can we maximize the potential? I would say maybe 2 or 3 points. First, moving from child participation here in the Voices of Children to considering children as agents of change. It's not only that they have a voice, it's not only that we need to listen to them, it's that they are actors in their own right. And I think it's conceptually interesting, but not being put very much in practice in many ways, and we talk about that in the climate change. And I will take the climate change again as a good case. Climate change is a crisis for all of us. But what I wanted to mention here is that climate change is a child rights crisis in its own right as well. And it's not in the future, it's now. So the threat for children's survival, for health, I mean, the levels of air pollution, there has been some estimates from Unicef and many others saying that 90% of children would be affected in one way or another about the climate rights climate change impact. So I think it's important to think through as agents of change in their own right. I think that's kind of a next step for all of us. Second point is we need to continue this journey, the journey of construction of this kind of delicate work that we're working on. And especially, we should not take it for granted. I think that's a very important thing. The building roads and the efforts that have been taken can disappear, can be vanished much quicker than we think. And I think it's really that we need to be careful with that. And the third point is not only for us, it's not only for the children in Belgium, but I would say we are referenced globally, as we have said, and I think the experience of Benoit in the committee is very clear on that. Our reference is instrumental for the children in the world, so I think it's important to keep there. I'll stay there. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia Alonso, Karl Hansen, and Benoit van Kersbelk for weighing in on this day.